He says reformed emo, but I'm still as emo as I ever was. Yeah. Brixton was nowhere near as scary as this either. Right. Hi everyone, you alright? The aim of the game today is I'm going to change how you write CSS, or at least that's what I'm going to try and do anyway. And I'm going to do that by talking about fluid type, fluid space, flexible layouts, all underpinned by progressive enhancement. And you might be wondering, well, why do we use progressive enhancement? And it's really important this. We build for everyone. We don't build for ourselves, we don't build for our peer groups, we don't build to look cool on Twitter. I know I certainly don't. We build for the global audience that is the web. Everyone uses the web that can access it, and everyone uses the web differently. And the important thing as well is that everyone should get a good experience. So that's why progressive enhancement is really good, because you build up from the simplest form. It means that everyone gets a good experience, and you just build up where supports are accessible to people. And I can guarantee that because of that, everyone's going to get the right experience on their device. They might not get the best experience, but it's an experience that will work, and no one will ever complain about that because it will work for them, and they'll be able to achieve what they need to achieve on your website. And with that in mind, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to make a website together. So if you visit this URL here, this is the website that we're going to build. Now, it doesn't matter whether you use your phone, your laptop, tablet. It should look right for you regardless of whatever you've got. And if you're comfortable, show what you see to the person next to you. And if you're really comfortable, take a screenshot and share it to the conference hashtag. And I'm confident that whatever you see on your device will look at least decent, if not perfect, if you've already got a pretty good browser. But you might not do, and that doesn't matter. But if you haven't had a chance to look at it, this is what we're building today. It's just it's a website. It's basically a big article. In fact, if you read this, you can just go, because this is the entire talk, and then you don't have to sit and listen to me chat shit for 40 minutes or whatever. So, but this is all about how to build things in this manner, built in this manner. It's all very meta, all very 2010. But let's start talking about how we actually build it. And I want to do a little bit of housekeeping first, because I know we all like to talk about tech and boring stuff like that. So you'll see a lot of CSS today. Just know that it's all smushed together with a bit of post-CSS. And underpinning the entire code base is my favorite tool, Tailwind CSS. I'm not joking. No, it isn't actually my favorite tool, but it's bloody useful. And I'm going to show you how you can use Tailwind CSS and not be an arsehole. And there's also a CSS methodology in play as well, and this is called Cube CSS. And what a methodology does is it gives you some rules and some ways to organize your CSS, basically. And just a quick touch on Cube, it's a methodology that's orientated towards pragmatism and simplicity, essentially. It's to help you hint the browser rather than micromanage it into shape. You give it some tips and hints, and then you let it do what it does best, which is be a browser. I'm not going to go into the detail about Cube today. I've done that before, and there's loads of information, documentation on cube.fyi, including a talk that I did that was specifically about Cube CSS once upon a time too. But just so we're all on the same page, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick tour of how it works, so you can understand why we're looking at bits of CSS, like what bits match what. So it's broken up into 5 parts. And the most important part is global CSS, and it's so important it doesn't even feature in the acronym. And the important thing to do with writing CSS in this manner is that you do as much as you can as high up as possible, because the browser's really good at working out what needs to look like what, because of inheritance and the cascade and the S word that I can't say. And it's doing as much up as high as possible means that you write less CSS, and that's surely going to be the aim of the game. Once you've done your global CSS, you start to think about layout, and that's where compositions come into play. And a composition in the context of Cube CSS is a super skeletal layout that can have anything in it. All it's worrying about is laying out content. It doesn't care if you put a card in there, it doesn't care if you put a button in there. All it cares about is how to lay content out, and that's its entire focus. Then you want to start colouring in. This is my favourite part. So the first thing I start to do when I'm colouring in is using utilities. And a utility in the context of Cube is a class that does one job, and it does that one job well. So a bit like Ron Seal when you're painting your fence. The sort of two main areas for a utility for me is one, Tailwind style, so applying single CSS properties to elements. And then the other one is like a group of properties that do one job, so like a wrapper that pushes all the content into the middle of the page. I see that as a utility class because you can pop it around all over the page. Then you get into the real colouring in, and that's where the blocks come into play. And a block is a component in Cube CSS, so that is your card or your button. And then finally, there's exceptions, which this is the only time where I want complete control over what's on the page. So an exception is a state change. Now, in other CSS methodologies, you might add modifier classes to elements, whereas in Cube, you use HTML selectors, data attributes. And there's two reasons for that. One, it's really obvious what's an exception in the code base. And the other is a data attribute can only ever be one value. So you get finite state and you get complete control. And that's really important when you're doing state changes. But that's enough about that. Let's start building something. And we start with the most important part of building a website, and that's HTML. It is the most important part of a website. Semantic HTML is the best foundation for any website. At least the heading hierarchy, and Jeremy mentioned that yesterday, at least headings on the page. It allows screen readers to navigate the page just by headings at least. And speaking of screen readers, it's really important to use Semantic HTML because it gives the tools that help people to consume content on the internet the best head start. So screen reader is the obvious choice. Browser is the other choice. But even the article reader in Safari, or I think Chrome does it now too. Scraping tools. There's many different tools that consume HTML. So using Semantic HTML gives them the best chance of taking that content, structuring it properly for the user at the end of the pipe. The other thing as well is if the CSS doesn't load, which it won't, the website will still make sense. So things happen on the network. If the CSS doesn't make it down, what the browser does is it creates user agent styles for you. It's like a light CSS sheet that every browser ships with. They all pretty much look the same these days. But if you use Semantic HTML, the page is going to make sense to the user when your CSS doesn't load, not if, when. I put if on there, but I should have put when. And the other thing as well, progressive enhancement again. You're going to get bored of me saying that by the end of this talk. All browsers are going to struggle with modern front-end tech that we're using today. We're using a lot of relatively modern CSS. They're not going to be able to understand it, but it doesn't matter because we're building up and we're building on a foundation. The older browsers are still going to get decent experience as well because we're using Semantic HTML. You get the HTML right, you've built a solid foundation. If you don't get the HTML right, you're building on sand, and we all know what happens when you do things like that. Fucking Tories. Right. So this is the overall structure of our page. We've got a main element, and then we've got a header, and then we're using landmarks to break each section of content up. And you might be thinking, what the hell is he using multiple articles for? Because it is just one long article. Well, Uncle Bruce Lawson wrote this really useful article, probably a few years ago now, where they explained that a section, which you might think to use for these landmarks, is actually just a spicy div. And an article is a much more efficient way of explaining to like assistive technology, especially landmarks of content and articles of content. So you can use as many articles as you like on a page. And when we look at our page now, so we've added all our HTML, we've added all our content, and it looks like this. Pretty good, right? Nice, clean HTML. Everything makes sense. You've got a heading hierarchy, you've got lists, you've got links. It just makes total sense. So we've got our nice foundation that we can build upon. So let's get into the real deal. So I've done a little bit of HTML stuff there, but really this is a CSS talk. So we're going to focus purely on CSS now. I might touch a little bit of HTML as we go, but really we're going to start getting into the real deal. So speaking of foundations, we've got our semantic HTML base. We're going to build on top of that now, and we're going to add a CSS reset. Now, a CSS reset in 2022 is not a CSS reset in 2010, where a reset in 2010 was like taking a sledgehammer to crack an egg, whereas now we're just making a couple of little adjustments to level the playing field across the board. Remember when I was talking about the user agent style sheets? They are very consistent now, but in some browsers they're slightly adrift of each other. So all we're doing now is leveling the playing field a little bit. So if we remind ourselves of what the page currently looks like. Looks decent. We're going to add just these 42 lines of CSS, which you probably can't really read, but it's not really that important because all we're doing is we're changing the box model to make sizing elements a little bit easier. We're just adjusting a few bits of spacing, how text renders, and apart from that, nothing much at all. And then what we get is this. So you can see it's all sort of smushed together now because we want to do the spacing ourselves. We've removed a bit of list styling, but really it doesn't look too different. We're just building up gradually. We're building in layers. We're not like hammering CSS at the page to make it look right. We're just adding CSS and giving the browser as much breathing space as we possibly can. So now we've got that nice foundation. We've got the semantic HTML. We've got a reset. We can start to do the most important part, which is the high-level CSS. So we can start to write some global CSS. Now, Tailwind's come to play, first of all. And what Tailwind's done for us here is it's taken some design tokens that I've set, and then it's converted them into CSS custom properties for us. And these go really high up on the page. They're the first thing that gets defined, apart from the guff that it ships as well. And you get these constants. I know they're CSS variables, but we treat them as constants at this point. These are our tokens, and we can use these throughout the site. Straight after these, we've got some handwritten variables too. So I'm going to take those tokens and I'm going to create contextual values of them. So for example, I've created a gutter variable for getting consistent space across the board. I've set some radius. I like consistent radius. Set some tracking, so that's the space between letters. So I'm just creating some consistency with some variables that I can use. And then what that allows me to do then is to start to apply CSS to the page. So the most important thing to do is do as much as high as possible as we can. So nearly every property that we're adding to the body, which the body has every visible element on the page in it, nearly all of those properties are inheritable by other elements that fall under the body. So just by setting this block of CSS, it makes an enormous impact on the page because you're letting the browser style the elements that fall under the body. You're not specifically adding styles to each element like you might do in a traditional Tailwind CSS setup. We're letting CSS do the job that it's good at, which is cascade and inheritance. But I'm just going to take you on a little side quest because this is my current obsession, and that is fluid type and fluid space. And before we get into typesetting, I really want to explain why I'm so obsessed with this stuff. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a different demo that's going to illustrate this concept perfectly. So imagine you've had this handed to you by a designer. We like doing stuff like this, where we'll make something that looks almost impossible to build responsively. And you see these huge headings and then this sort of like tiny text. And you're probably thinking to yourself, that's fine, I'll just use some media queries and I'll create some sizes and work up the scale and all that. But then I need to show you this. So this is from a OpenSignal report. And what it did was illustrate the the device size fragmentation across Android devices. And as you can see, you can barely even see some of them in that bottom right-hand corner. Is this highlighting going to work today? Oh yeah, like these ones down here, there's loads down there. So you've got to remember two things when you look at this diagram. Number one, this is 7 years old. So this is in 2015. I imagine a lot of Android devices have come out since then. And the other thing, the most important thing, is this is just Android devices. So this doesn't include Macs, it doesn't include PCs, it doesn't include all those weird and wonderful little cheap phones that you can get that are Android. There is cars have browsers in them now. There's all these like browsers all over the place. So you can't really break key parts of your web design into 3 neat breakpoints anymore because you're going to miss so much. And it's illustrated perfectly here. As you move through the viewport, the text is either humongous or it's too small. There's never really a sweet spot. And I know it's a rather over-exaggerated example, but this is the case for any sort of creative web design, especially on the web. And the CSS that I've written to do this is actually all right. You know, we're using rem units, so they're relative units. That's great. It's honouring the user's font size preferences. We're building up from the smallest viewport into the largest viewport. And then you're thinking, what's cool? Just add some more media queries. All right, let's get some more in there. We'll just add a few more little adjustments. But how many media queries is it going to take before I achieve good typography across all those screen sizes, it's just not going to happen. So how about doing it like this instead? So what we're doing here is we're using the fluid rule instead that's sizing the text based on the viewport itself. When you actually break it down in CSS, it uses a relatively new feature in CSS called clamp. And how clamp works is you've got 3 parameters that you pass into it. So the first parameter is the minimum size, so it can never get smaller than this. The middle parameter is the ideal size, and then the last parameter is the largest size. So you've got these nice locks at either side, and then in the middle, you're letting the browser decide how big to render the type based on the rules that you're giving it. And the way that that calculation's working in the middle, it's saying try and use about 5 viewport width units, so that it's broken into 100, so it's like 5% of the browser window. And then the most important part is we're adding a rem unit to that. And the reason why we do that is because if you try to zoom into text, if it's just viewport units, the viewport shrinks as you zoom, so the text will never grow. I don't know how this works, but the browser does some magic shit that allows you to zoom text. And that's another important point, is you don't have to understand all the comp sci rubbish. You just need to learn how to use it. So I know that's going to be fine. A user's going to be able to zoom into the text. Everyone's a winner. And you get this beautiful fluid typography. So that's the first point. So we've got the how, but then you start to apply some design detail to that too. So we've been using scales in design forever, back in print and even in digital. And this is what a scale looks like. So a scale is a ratio-based system. So this scale here is a major third scale, and the ratio for a major third scale is 1.25. So as you go up the scale, you multiply the following size by 0.25, and that's how you get that lovely linear curve between sizes. And if you break that down into how the sizes work, you can see there the mathematics that go with it, and you just get this nice, with the major third especially, a sort of shallow linear curve between sizes. That works really well though if you've got a single screen size. So if you're looking at Josh's 800 pixel website from yesterday, that would work an absolute treat. But remember, we've got an unknown amount of screen sizes to work with. So it's actually probably better to do 2 type scales. One where you've got not much room, because smaller viewports, there's not much room for that linear curve. And then when you've got loads of room, you can have a much more aggressive curve to get more expressive typography. So, and this tool is called Utopia, utopia.fyi. And what it does is it allows you to set a couple of base viewports up. So I've gone for 320 because remember we're using lock sizes, so the type can only get as small as a certain size. And then I go up to roughly about where the wrapper width is for the content on a large screen, and then give it some base font sizes and some type scales. For those interested, these are the ones that we're using for our website. So a slightly larger wrapper, a slightly larger base font size, and a much larger type scale to go with it, which is an augmented 4th. And what you get is this. Pretty ugly, I agree, but it doesn't matter, because remember, we're setting these really high up on the page as constants. We set them and we forget them, and we've got ourselves a responsive type scale that's also fluid. And that's our typography done. All we have to do is apply it. And what we get is this. So as you can see, the curve gets much deeper as the viewport increases, and as it decreases, it gets much shallower. So we can get really expressive where we've got space, and where we haven't got space, we can be nice and conservative, not that conservative. Spacing is near enough the same deal. We use these same base units, and then instead of using the scales, you use custom multipliers. And the reason for that is it's more useful to have more control over spacing. You could fill these values in with those multipliers if you really wanted to, but spacing you like a little bit more control. But the real magic in spacing is these pairs that Utopia generates. So what it does is it takes the smallest value from one pair, and then it goes up a step, and then it takes the largest value of that. As you can see on that bottom one especially, you can create this fluid space where the viewport allows it. And that powers stuff like this. So you see these regions of content and these chunks. There's much more vertical space as you get down the viewports, but as you go back into the smaller viewports, the space is much more compact. So you can make use of what the browser's giving you in terms of sizes, and then you can say, look, aim for this for the space, and it'll give you the right amount of space for the viewport that it's got. Pretty good, right? So now you understand the reasoning behind the fluid type stuff. Let's actually implement it. So this is where we left off, with mostly inheritable properties. So we can start to get into a bit more detail now. So we'll start tackling our headings first. We're using Inter as our font here because everyone uses Inter. And because Inter's got shallow ascenders and descenders, they're the uppy bits and the downy bits on your font, we can have a really tight line height because you're not going to get that overlap between them. So we're doing that there, and big type with tight line heights looks nice. And then as you can see, we're working down the size scale from H1 to H2 to H3 because, of course, we're using Semantic HTML. So the headings are going to be in the right order. So therefore, when we size them in the right order, it's all going to look fine. And then we're going to add a couple more adjustments to typography too. So long lines of text read like shit and look like shit. Because if you've got cognitive issues with or learning difficulties, or you find reading hard, if you've got to read across a really long line of text and then drop down to the next line and go right back to the beginning and then read across there again, it's a fucking nightmare. And it looks shit. So what we do is we reduce the width of long-form content, prose content, and we use character units to do that as well. So a CH unit in CSS is equal to the width of a 0 character in the rendered font size and font family. So you can make a pretty decent typeset just by using that unit. Now we've got massive type on this site, so we've actually used quite a small line length. So 50 characters. If you were to have your sort of usual 16-ish pixel body copy size, you want to aim for about 65 to 70 characters for that line length. And because headers are massive as well, we can really reduce the width of those too. It makes everything read better, it makes it look better, dead easy. And the rest of the global CSS is pretty compact because it's not a very complicated design, is it? It's pretty straightforward. So all we need to do is, size some icons, change some link styles, do our interactive states, and some block quotes. And what we get is this. And it's starting to look pretty good at this point. You can see those line lengths in control now. Block quotes could probably do with being a bit shorter, but it's too late. I've already published it, so it's all good. But you get the gist of what I'm going for. And as you can see, I'm not sweating the details because it's just not important. The most important thing is that the user gets a good experience. So where we're at now, we've got Semantic HTML, we've got a nice reset, we've got global CSS, so we can start to do the fun part now, which is coloring in, and we're going to start to do that with some utilities. Now, these are the best 3 lines of CSS that I've ever written. I should have retired after this, but I carried on working through it and just making a fool out of myself. But I'll explain how this tiny little utility works because this will transform typesetting on the site for you. In fact, just all vertical spacing. So it's called the flow utility. If you've read every layout before, it's the stack, but me and Hayden argued about what we call it, and I decided to stick with my idea, which was flow. And how it works is you've got a lobotomized owl selector. And that is a term that he coined, and that's the star plus star selector. And what that does is say select direct siblings of that element, or select sibling elements of that element. Now, the direct part comes from the arrow combinator, because if we just left star plus star, every child element that fell under that class would then have margin applied to it. So the arrow combinator selects only the direct siblings, so the direct children that follow that element. Now, the real important part in this utility is this. Oh, easy. So we're looking for this variable here, flow space. And if we can't find that variable flow space, we're going to use a 1m fallback. So it doesn't matter if flow space isn't defined. That's fine. The space that's added to the elements is going to be based on its font size. And because we've used the type scale, the font, there's going to be natural flow and rhythm on the spacing that gets added to these elements too, because we're using that scale. And as you can see, the paragraphs all have the same space as each other because they're all the same size, but that subheading is a larger font size and it's got an M-based spacing, so then you get that natural flow and rhythm between HTML semantic elements too. So it's a win-win for everybody. But you can also have some more finite control. So imagine I've made myself a little block called my context, And in there, I'll define the flow space variable. And then if I do that, I get consistent spacing across the board. So you get that control, but you also let the browser do its job. There's another utility as well. We've already touched on this, which is the spacing between regions of content. Well, we use the exact same model to do that too. So we're looking for we've got the utility is called region, and then we've got a variable called region space that we're looking for, and we apply that to the top and bottom. You could use padding block logical property if you wanted, but I prefer to make it read easier at this point. And then the important part is you can pass a variable as your fallback as well. So I'm passing one of my spacing scale variables in there, and that was that spacing pair that I was talking about earlier. So just by having that utility, I can drop that on all the regions of content, and then you get that natural spacing between them. And you get the spacing that's responsive to the viewport too. So we've written very, very little CSS, and we're already starting to look pretty good. You've got some big old chunky spaces there, but that's cool. We'll sort it out. We'll color it in. But really, everything's starting to look pretty tidy at this point. Still written very little CSS, still building up in layers. And we can add another layer to it now, which is the compositional layouts. Now, just a quick plug while I'm here for that. We wrote a book, and it's all about this stuff, like composing layouts. Rather than making components do the layout themselves, it's writing a skeletal layout and using a compositional approach to it too. Thought I'd give you some big old chunky discount because we like this conference. So yeah, feel free to give me a shout if you need a link to that later as well. But back to the real deal. We've got one layout on this page, one main layout, and that's a grid. We love grids. We put them on every fucking website we design. And often, grid, as from the work I used to do as like CSS consultancy and the work I do now as an agency, everyone over-engineers grids. And I don't know why, because they're really easy, especially when you use modern CSS. So we've got this grid here of cards, and then we've got this grid here of tools that we like to use to build things. Now you're probably thinking, okay, you've got a 2-column grid, a 3-column grid, so sure you're going to use some media queries to do that. Nah, we'll use the browser. Let the browser do it instead for us. So this is the grid composition. Now you could use flex or you could use grid, and if the question is, Andy, should I use grid or flex? The answer is, if it works, it's right. It doesn't matter. Use whatever you want. It really doesn't matter. I like to use grid for this, and it'll become clear soon why. But the thing I really like about grid here is you can use that repeatable column definition. So this grid, what we're saying here is we're using the repeat function. So this will repeat for as many times as you say, or you can use a grid placement property, which in this case is, again, looking for a CSS custom property value of grid placement. And then if grid placement can't be found, we're going to use autofill. And what that does is it tells grid to carry on making columns as many as it can fit before it starts to look rubbish, essentially. And then the second part is the sizing of those columns. So grid's got this function called min-max, which is a bit like clamp, but you don't get the middle part. And what we're doing there is, again, we're looking for a grid min-item size custom property, or falling back to 16 rem, which, if you want a pixel version, is about 280 pixels. And then the maximum size is 1 FR, which is a fractal unit. And what that essentially means is whatever space is left between what's been calculated already, share it equally between all the columns. So let's apply it to our grid. That looks rubbish. Like, what have we done wrong? You're probably thinking at this point, right, time to get the sledgehammer out and make it look really tight. We don't need to do that. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to lean on browsers being shit. So Safari does this great thing with VoiceOver, where if you add a class to it's only some versions of Safari or VoiceOver, you add a class of, like a CSS class to a list, and it'll remove all the list semantics for VoiceOver, which is bloody useful. Apparently, it's not a bug, it's a feature. I don't believe them. So the way to get around that is to add a role of list back to the list. So if you ever see UL role equals list or OL role equals list, the developer's not a fool. They're just adding semantics back to a list that already had the semantics anyway. But we can use this as an opportunity. So what I like to do here is make a reasonable assumption that if a list has got a class on it, it might not want to look quite like a list. So this has been tackled already by the reset. The reset's got a little selector like this that removes the list style. And then in our global CSS, I go back to that and I remove padding. So I get this. And it still looks shit, but we're not gonna succumb to the pressure, and we're gonna use all of the tools that we've already put in place to make it look good. So remember how all of the grid system stuff was looking for these custom property values? Well, we can start to define them to give the grid a little bit more power. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use an exception, and that's one of those HTML data attribute selectors I was talking about. And we've given it a name of 50/50, two-column grid. We're setting the grid placement to be auto-fit instead of auto-fill. And what that does is instead of trying to fill it with columns, it'll allow the columns to grow into space instead. And then the magic is setting the min and max item size. So it was 16 rem. We're going to nick that value because it's pretty handy. In the middle, we're going to set it to be 50 VW, which is 50% of the screen. And then we're going to give it a maximum 2. Now, the detail-orientated out there, we're probably thinking they're never going to be 50% of the screen because you've got a wrapping container. And it doesn't matter because we're mentoring the browser. We're not micromanaging it. We're giving it an idea of what we want it to do. We're giving it the tools and the values to work it out for itself. And then it does exactly that. So this is how the grid now looks in all the viewports, and you can see where there's space, it'll break into a nice two-column layout. And where there isn't space, it'll stack nicely into a stack layout like that. Job done, easy peasy. So that's our layout done. I'll touch on the 3-column version while I'm in this section because I'll show you how I like to really do this stuff in a minute. But let's start doing some proper colouring in. Remember these little curvy boys? You might be thinking, right, CSS clip path, let's do some like real mad stuff with that. But no, I do it easier than that. You just draw an SVG in Illustrator. And then there's only one thing we need to change about that SVG. And what I've done there is I've removed the aspect ratio that SVG has naturally based on its view box. I don't really want to go into much about SVGs because I find them so fucking boring. But you add that, and basically, if you squish your SVG around, it'll squish with you rather than fighting you. And that's because we've got a block called curve that we've just added to our code base. And what the curve block does is we set it to a block element, so it removes that stupid little 2-pixel space that some browsers add to it. We set a fixed height on it, and this is for all viewports, because it doesn't matter if the curve's massive and it doesn't matter if the curve's shallow, because who cares? Like, it's still a curve. And the person looking at the site's not going to care that their curve might be different to someone else's curve. But really, we want to try and maintain a little bit of control of our curve. And again, we're using the same model. So to color in the curve, we're looking for a spot color variable. And if that spot color variable hasn't been defined, we're defaulting to color light. And that's why we've got loads of space at the moment on the page, because those curves are present, but also visually hidden at this point. So we can actually start to colour the curves in as well. So I've created another block, and that's called a section. And that enhances the region utility that we've already got, and that's how we colour those sections of content in on the page. So the first thing we're adding to the section is we're flipping curves that appear as the first child on the head, so they're an uppy curve rather than a downy curve. And then we're looking for the spot colour in here too. So we're going to set the background colour to be the spot colour. And if that's not defined, then we're going to fall back to the dark colour because we're setting our text to be a light colour instead. Then we're just styling up the block quotes that look like headings. But what you get is this. In order to colour this in, all I had to do is add a single utility class of spot colour, which is secondary in this case. And this is the only bit of JavaScript you're going to see in a slide by me. This is some that I cobbled together in the Tailwind config. And it generates custom utility classes. So the clever people at Tailwind only let you use certain parts of CSS, which I find rather limiting. So what I do here is I'm generating custom utilities that set CSS custom property values. So I've set the spacing one for flow space, and then I'm using the colors to do the spot color one as well. So I apply that spot color utility, and you get that. So it's colored everything in for us already. So you just apply them to each of the sections, stick into the coloring in. Let's start coloring in our cards. So these are quite simple. All we've got to do is set the background color, and we've got to add some border radius. So we've done that. But the thing to make note of is this last property here. We're unsetting the max width. And the reason why we're doing that is because, remember, blocks fight against the global CSS. In the global CSS, we made a presumption that, well, we're making a presumption here of the block that a card is going to be a list element at some point. And we're fighting against this rule that we set earlier in the type setting where we were giving it a maximum character width. And what this allows us to do is to let the layout take over and size the cards for us. So we go into our browser and it looks like this. Looks all right. We've got this big old space at the bottom here though, so we want to get rid of that. So let's do a Masonry layout. Now, Masonry layouts have been around forever. Once upon a time, you used to have to put a truckload of JavaScript on the page to do it. But now CSS Grid gives us Masonry powers. There's one problem though. Only Firefox supports it, and only when you've got a flag turned on in the browser settings, which means probably one person's got Masonry support at the moment. But that doesn't matter because we're using progressive enhancement. So we're going to set an exception on our list. Data rows equals Masonry. We're going to go back into our grid composition. We're going to do one. I've got a fly buzzing around me. We've got data rows equals Masonry selector in there. And all it takes to do Masonry is one line, grid template rows Masonry. And what that'll do is the browser will pack the content like blockwork on the page. And then we thought, while we're in here, we'll enhance the experience where Masonry is not supported. So we set the alignment to start in grid. It won't stretch the items. It'll just let them size themselves based on the content. So this is what it actually looks like in the browser. And I'm willing to bet my mortgage that not a single person in this room knew that this was a Masonry layout when they looked at this page because of progressive enhancement. And there is the chef's kiss, as it were, because that is why we do progressive enhancement. We're writing very little CSS. Everyone's getting a good experience. For that one person that's got Firefox support, they get this experience, so they're the real winners, but everyone else is a winner too. So the last bit of CSS, and then I'll go. We're going to write CSS how I really like to write CSS. And this is why I came up with Cube CSS. The whole idea of it was to be able to make finite adjustments with an effect as much as possible with as little CSS as possible. So we've got this 3-column grid, and we've got the little icons and everything. So the first thing we're going to do is create a badly named block name called features. It doesn't matter what you call your classes. And then inside of there, we're setting grid placement to auto-fit again. So remember that from the 50/50 layout, we're letting the columns grow. Instead of using 50%, we're going to go for 33%. But notice how I'm not doing 33.3333% because it doesn't matter because we're giving the browser a hint. We're mentoring it. We're not micromanaging it. We're setting some gutter so it's got a nice bit of space because CSS custom properties are contextually aware as well. So you can use specificity, which I can't say, and override the global value that we already set. Set a tighter flow space, and the only CSS we've actually written on this block is text-align center, so it's essentially like a configuration object. We write a little bit of CSS to make everything else look pretty in there, and then we end up with that. So we're basically affecting the entire page with all these things that have already been set for us. We're just grabbing it, refining it, writing very little CSS, and then we've got this, our beautiful website. Now, I've not been able to go into all the detail on how to build this. So what I did is I published it on Glitch, which is like posh CodePen. And what you can do is you can see all the, not just the CSS, you can see how the markup's been put together, you can see the design tokens, you can see everything that's gone into it. And then most importantly, you can, what they call remixing, you can grab a copy of it yourself and play with it and try and mess around with all these like ways of building things so you can really get into it. But I'll just wrap up with this bit of thought leading. We've never had it better with browsers. So I came into this industry in 2009-ish. Responsive web design was just peeking around the corner, but we were plagued with IE6 and IE7 support. There was this horrible period, which I don't like to think about too much, where we had to build responsive websites that also worked in IE6, which was pure hell. And I think a lot of these like over-enthusiastic, over-engineered approaches to CSS have come from that era. And to be fair, it's understandable because it was bloody horrible doing front end in those days. And like you think these tools are probably now redundant because, like especially like tools like Tailwind or CSS&JS, like they might be redundant now because the browser's so good. But I actually prefer to think of them as repurposed in a sense. So I've mentioned Tailwind a few times in the talk, but Tailwind is almost like a silent partner in this code base. It's doing the job that it's good at, which is taking a load of like configuration and generating a few utility classes on demand. And it's also generating some custom properties for me as well. It's not going on Twitter and shouting at people about how good it is. It's just doing that one job that it's good at. And that's how it should be used. So you might also be thinking, that website was all right, Andy. You know, it looks pretty good. But it's a very sort of controlled example, isn't it? So does it scale, which I always get asked, for when you're building your social network that'll never take off? Or does it kind of use it in my big enterprise piece of software? Maybe not. I imagine there's some tech debt that'll make you cry in there. But it has been applied on much bigger projects. Last year, got commissioned by Google to rebuild the front end of web.dev and give them a nice light design system to go with it. And the brief was really simple. It was, we've got an engineering team and we want them to be able to build pages, new sections of the site, with little to no intervention from designers. So naturally, we thought, well, we'll give them this completely flexible system. We'll give them fluid type, we'll give them fluid space. We'll give them this like nice cascade model so they can quickly theme things and apply things. And so far, it's worked so good for them. But that's also a really boring website. You can build more creative sites too. So this is a site that we've built in the studio recently. It's currently in QA. You might see some lipsum on there. Just ignore it, it's fine. We have got a content strategy, I promise. But this is a slightly more creative design. It's got some more expressiveness to it. It's got a nice theme. It's got like some pages are super layover designed. Some pages are nice and simple. But because we built it in this system, it's been an absolute doddle to build, and it's working perfectly in all viewports. And you can go even more creative with this too. So often when I talk about simplifying CSS, I'll get someone in my Twitter mention saying, oh, I build creative websites. So do I. So this was commissioned last year, and you can see the type scale on this site especially is unbelievable. Like the typography is absolutely huge on large screens, and it's absolutely tiny on small screens. So again, using fluid type, fluid space, progressive enhancement, so all these fancy glitchy bits only work where there's support for them. Everyone gets a good experience on the site. Everyone's a winner, and that's the most important thing. So to leave you with something is a tip in life. Always challenge overcomplicated solutions to everything. You might come up with the overcomplicated solution, or it might be a teammate or a client. Always push back. Always try to simplify, because there's always a simpler way of doing things. Take all the things you've learned today and go and build excellent websites. Thank you very much.